No problem here.
Okay, so in terms of context, essentially, so we are running this company that has created this set of tools that essentially is a Creative Commons based set of tools that you may know, I guess, little. And so at the moment we have, I think, several thousands of users. So we cannot even catch them up, because it's being open source. It's hard to say how many people, but we guess more or less we're talking about 50,000 or something like that of people that have been using the tools to design any kind of entrepreneurial endeavors. We've been working directly with many players, such as ranging from startups to the UN, basically. And we have been surprised many times, by people say, we have been using the toolkit and we didn't even know them, and doing amazing work. So, for example, something that happened with you guys, if I remember well, because Griff told me, that you have been using a little bit of PDT to thinking about what you are doing, so which is amazing. And the idea that we started in January is that, so basically we said, okay, it's no more just about platforms, it's not about one entity doing a strategy, it's much more about understanding what's going on in general at the systemic level, and trying to integrate our systemic awareness into the design process and into the organizational development process. So now we are active into many fields. I would say, the context, the traditional context is that of helping organizations to understand their ecosystems and design strategies to mobilize the ecosystem. But beyond that, now we're moving into, okay, also how do we factor in the complex dynamics, and how do you go beyond this idea that it's just one company that designs strategy, but it's more like, how do we fit into a more systemic transition? And also we are into organizational development. We are working with pioneers such as also the Chinese company Hire, which is pretty interesting in terms of their organizational development models. So I think we are really moving into this middle ground between what one would call the pioneers, like the emergent ideas in the space of DAOs or distributed organizations or collective decision making, and even intellectual dark web, I would say, bringing these into the business and organizational development context. So to say that, I think we are trying to make this synthesis and explain that there is no more separation between these worlds. And it's really about understanding how organizing in general is evolving in the context of more contextual social transitions. And that's it. So that's where we are. This is I think the third case study we record. Our case studies are a bit not very, I would say, regular, because, for example, sometimes you speak with companies that have been doing platform strategies. Sometimes you speak with emergent projects, like we did last week with Aragon, and now this week with you. And yeah, also we're talking with other projects that are more into this social fabric. So that's where we start.
Very cool. Very cool. So yeah, so I guess my a couple of questions in terms of what you would like to see, or the goals of this of the interview, because we have been using the platform design toolkit, as you mentioned, and I have a few, especially in the token engineering space, and we've been doing that at the Common Stack kind of as.
No, you're dropping out a bit in terms of sound. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Is it better now?
Yeah.
Sometimes it has a funny pickup, but yeah, we've been using the platform design toolkit as one like kind of the early stage of the token engineering design process. So starting out with kind of like needs gathering, because a lot of people come to the token engineering community and say, you know, oh, hey, can you token engineer this? And we say, well, you need to, you know, come up with your specifications of your system. Who are the users? What do they need? What are their incentives? What are their behaviors? And we found the platform design toolkit and also some spin-offs. There's also the ecosystem design toolkit. I'm not sure if you guys have are associated with that or you've seen that. I think
no, we're not associated, but we have been informed about the fork that goes more into tokens and so on. So
right. Okay. Cool. So yeah, that's a fork of the PDT. I thought so. And yeah, I think this is like a great starting point for people to understand the kind of systemic considerations that need to go into token engineering, and then taking it into the kind of like CAD modeling steps from there. I actually have a few Miro boards open on my computer that I can show at some point. I don't want to jump right into it if you have a structure for this interview that you were planning, but I can definitely walk through how some of our community has been using the PDT, the ecosystem design toolkit, and also some of the kind of CAD modeling frameworks, and how it seems to form a nice like requirements gathering and baseline modeling for more rigorous engineering design in the token engineering and CAD fashion. So I would be happy to do that as well.
So we don't have much structure. I mean, we have some structure, but I think we're not attached to that. So if you believe that it's beneficial at some point to jump into the conversation and share this, I think I'm also, we only have some time constraints, which is the hard stop at, well, actually hard stop is not even the case, because if needed, we can go a bit further, but we don't want to make it super long. So for the sake of potentially sharing with the community. So that's it. I mean, I'm totally fine. I think it would be great to have this kind of vision that you spoke about.
I think if you're ready, we can just kick off. Okay. I think for what already Simone introduced, one of the common ground that we're all involved, Jeff, as your work and other organizations are facing this 360 disruption. So one of the I think a good start that we can introduce Common Stack is shaping itself as a cell to instill tools that could boost and generate a commons in its economy. So if I ask you to start creating the introduction of how can we describe the Common Stack value proposition and introduce how the Common Stack purpose to the wider audience would be, I think, a great start.
Sure, yeah. So the Common Stack is aiming to bring token engineering, modeling and simulation and design into kind of the rigorous design of useful components in the DAO ecosystem. And I think what we've seen so far is that there are lots of different protocols working on very neat parts. You know, holographic consensus is a great mechanism. Budget boxing is a great mechanism. Quadratic voting is a great mechanism. But when you combine these into larger systems, there are lots of ways that they can fail non-intuitively. It's not that you can just compose mechanisms and everything works fine. So what we're trying to bring into the space is the token engineering rigor, where you can understand the bounds and failure points of these components, and when you layer them together, how these things can play out in real world environments. And we realize that engineering design process is complex because it starts from mathematical principles, the foundations of the components we're building. So our idea is that we can build replicable components that like crypto primitives, almost like bonding curves or conviction voting as a governance mechanism, the Giveth proposal engine, and combine these together to take steps forward from the DAO ecosystem where we are today to a DAO ecosystem that you know can scale and serve the needs of communities who want to adopt these kind of commons-based or more egalitarian democratic structures.
So I think if all these elements can be basically picked, and then they create basically the common ground for this commons economy. So if we then we translate this in a marketplace mechanism, and we look at Common Stack as a source that could then generate a marketplace mechanism evolution. So as an open source approach. So how are the transaction between, let's say, commons and members in the marketplace would happen? And how is the open source guaranteed in the marketplace for a long term?
Right. So I think that one of the most important considerations is that there is no one governance type or no one funding type or no one, DAO that will serve every community's needs. It's highly contextual to the situation and the goals of that community. So this is one of the reasons that we're looking to CAD simulations, because each of these tools can be parameterized. So we're not saying, here is the tool, everyone should use this. It's saying, here is a commonly used design pattern, convivial tool that can be customized on all of these parameters, and also combined with different components as needed in the context, and then also parameterized to that specific context, and then also run through a simulation like a digital twin. And I can go a bit more into digital twins if that's an unfamiliar concept. That's kind of a cyber physical systems engineering practice. Is that familiar? Are you guys familiar with digital twins, or should I go?
Probably, if for the audience, it would be even interesting to create an example of parameters, and then the connection with digital twins. So they could be create like more a flavor of what we're talking about.
Sure. Yeah, so I guess a couple of different examples of DAOs that we see today. There are, community funding clubs where groups of people come together and want to fund, important work that will move the ecosystem forward. This is like Moloch DAO or Meta Cartel. There are also other decentrally collaborative groups like RLoop, which is a distributed engineering team, and they actually collaborate with engineers around the world on like XPRIZE challenges. And they're a really interesting distributed team of engineers, but the needs of, a funding club or an engineering team in the DAO space would be very different. So in terms of parameters, you could say, one group may need a bonding curve as a funding mechanism. Another may not. Maybe they just need some kind of collaborative governance mechanism like conviction voting. Also, each of these parameters themselves, each of these components, the bonding curve or conviction voting, have their own parameters. How long should a vote be open before X amount of funds are spent? That would change if you are a 5-person community or a 500-person community. So all of these different, the curve shape, the length of proposal, all of these questions are parameters that can be set by a community when they are launching, when they're instantiating these tools from the Common Stack library. And an example of a digital twin, so any complex cyber physical system. So for example, like an airplane engine. When an airplane takes a flight, say from Paris to London, that engine is running for 6 hours. In tandem, they have the simulation, the digital twin of that engine running at the same time. And when the plane lands and the engineers come up and they can plug in their diagnostic tool and compare all of the specs of the digital twin engine with the real engine. And they can see, oh, this temperature is this much higher, or there's an issue here. It just gives them a clue where the real world engine may differ from the digital twin engine, and then they can look into that spot if there might be a problem. So this is a way that we can kind of manage complexity when we have a digital twin held up against our real world system, and then say, where do these differ? What kind of assumptions can we make about the state of the real world based on our understanding of the digital twin?
Okay, so the augmented bonding curve is also setting condition for economic patterns potentially. Would you say so? Would you consider as a simulation contest for potentially also local currencies, for example?
Definitely. So the bonding curve actually introduces the invariant that the engineering of the system relies on to some extent. And all engineering relies on invariance to some extent. When we reduce dimensionality, we actually have design ability. You see this in when you create a building, we rely on invariants like F equals MA, you know, or the fact that gravity is effectively a constant. You know, if gravity were changing every day, none of our skyscrapers would stand. You know, in electronics, V equals IR, and with that, we're able to build, you know, electronics and circuits. If we didn't have these reductions of dimensionality through mathematical invariance, we wouldn't be able to design stable systems. So this is essentially what the bonding curve offers in the economic sphere. We can say that there is some supply that will always be matched by reserve in this curve. And I'm sure you've seen some of these diagrams before where it's supply and reserve or supply and price. Some people sometimes do, but essentially that curve is a dimensional reduction. And you're saying that, you know, all agents in the system, regardless of their personal preference, we can't say what people will do. We can't predict people. They're not rational economic agents, but we can say what will happen if they do this, because we know the supply and reserve will always remain constant on that bonding curve. So again, we're very early days in the experimentation of this, but in the future, I think this will allow for much more rigorous engineering design of crypto economic systems.
And sorry, if I can just jump in a bit on this stage and just take maybe one step back to see, can you explain a bit who is in your ecosystem, like in that kind of marketplace that you, well, I don't know marketplace, but you know, you provide a set of tools for agents from what I hear. So if you could just elaborate maybe a little bit on what is the ecosystem, like who is there?
So who would use the common stack components, you mean?
Yeah.
So this could be used by definitely widely varying groups. I think our early targets is the crypto space, because they're already familiar with a lot of these tools. So clubs like Moloch or Metacartel could use a bonding curve as a funding mechanism. Right now, it's basically a donation system. And what we are trying to address at the Common Stack is to reward that altruistic behavior that we see in grant programs, which is essentially what Moloch and Metacartel are, is a funding club or a grant program where people donate and then get to allocate those funds per the number of tokens they got from that donation, but turning that into a continuous funding stream. So we're trying to align incentives of philanthropists so that they can continue to be altruistic without burning all their cash and burning out of you know, the altruist burnout problem that we see in a lot of the world today.
Probably,
so
would you say, Jeff, that I was following also another, probably indirectly, just next to what Stina was asking. So would you say also the case of grassroots economics network and the Red Cross could be maybe another contest that could be part of the ecosystem that maybe we can mention? I mean, ideally later I would have another question about this, but given that we are now visiting this area, we can, if you agree, you could see that this is a part of the ecosystem. Maybe you can also share some details if it's the case.
Definitely. So yeah, Will Ruddock and the Community Inclusion Currency Initiative in Kenya is one we heavily support. And we're working with them to basically implement a bonding curve it's basically a transparent and more democratic form of central banking because the way the CIC system works in specifically, so the Red Cross does cash voucher assistance for villages that are prone to cash crises. So in rural Kenya, cash dries up for part of the year, fiat cash, like Kenyan shillings, nobody has it. There are still farmers who need work. There are still workers who want to work on the farm, but there's no cash to facilitate the transaction. So the Red Cross and other NGOs, the gold standard of aid these days is cash voucher assistance. So in other words, when these times of cash illiquidity happens in these communities, they actually just dump cash, not dump cash, they give everyone money. and then they prime the pump of the economy, and then those local economies can spur themselves forward. The problem with injecting these communities with fiat cash is that the fiat cash generally is siphoned back to the big cities through the import-export market. So what they're doing instead is instantiating a local currency. They put the US dollars or the Kenyan shillings, or I mean, it effectively is XDAI, which I mean is a fiat backing. They put that into the bonding curve and they issue community currency from the bonding curve. So they say for every dollar that goes into the bonding curve, they issue $4 worth of local currencies, Sarafu, CICs, whatever you want to call them. So for every dollar that goes into the bonding curve, $4 come out. And there are rules on how those can be redeemed back to the bonding curve. So you can only redeem up to 50% of your holdings, provided you have spent 50% of your holdings. So this encourages some guaranteed local volatility of the currency before it can possibly be transferred back to Kenyan shilling and is often exported back to the main cities along the import-export lines. In early experiments, they've seen, because they're effectively creating currency, they're putting $1 in reserve and creating 4 out. And they also see a 5x improvement on local volatility of the coin, of the local currency. So overall, they're seeing about 20x improvement over just giving $1 to a villager. If they do it through a bonding curve, every $1 of Red Cross aid turns into $20 of local economic expansion. So this is extremely effective over the gold standard of aid in cash voucher assistance today.
I think we'll go back on the co-creation about the impact of these experiments later. Probably, I think to follow now on moving on the governance about Common Stack, how a governance model would work, how would effectively create a flow in the ecosystem. So I was looking at also the vision of the trusted seeds. That seems to be a sort of a cultural code of conduct. So, and then it could enable key members to connect with expertise within the governance needs. So how is, in this case, the trusted needs, or if you have any other example, supporting the governance design in Common Stack?
And maybe also briefly need an explanation of the trust seed to make it clarity for.
Yeah, for sure. So the trusted seed, yeah, we've identified in DAO ecosystems. At the Common Stack, we're a big fan of the Commons and Ostrom's principles. And Ostrom's principles are all about, polycentric governance and ensuring that you have a trusted community of people, because essentially we're not building faceless, anonymous online communities. We are building trusted environments that allow collaboration P2P on a global scale. So the trusted seed is a community of people who are altruistic. They have contributed in some way to the build of the Common Stack, whether that is financially or with their time or labor. We give them C-Stack tokens for their contributions. And by holding C-Stack tokens, they're now in the trusted seed. So the trusted seed is basically a community of experts in online governance, in token engineering, in commons-based collaboration paradigms, and so on. And these people are able to participate in the launch of all of the commons that have that use Common Stack tool components. So, for example, if the CIC initiative wants to launch a new community currency, they could invite all C-Stack token holders to participate in the hatch of their system. So when they launch a bonding curve, you can contribute capital to this bonding curve and receive governance tokens in return. There are all sorts of protections over kind of like the pump and dump, get rich quick capabilities of a bonding curve, because of course a bonding curve in the early days, you get a lot of tokens for a very little price. And then later on, it starts to slow down towards sort of an area of maturity. So we have vesting measures in place. Those can be time-based or activity-based in the community. I won't go too much into that, but essentially it's creating a trusted culture of people who are aligned around a cause. And this is the cause that that Commons is looking to push forward with. So it's basically creating that trusted environment where we have people who can move forward in this mission together, rather than having a faceless, trustless online environment, because we've seen those environments fall apart without trusted communities and constitutions that are kind of agreeing on acceptable behaviors in these communities. So it's working on the cultural side of DAOs, trying to make them warm. We find a lot of the DAOs today are very cold, they're very technical and mechanistic, and we definitely see the need for the cultural build as well as the technical build of these socio-technical tools.
So, and I guess now I'm thinking to ask, in terms of, as a trusted seed would act as a sort of orchestrator that comes in when it's needed. So what are the boundaries, and what do you think as an orchestrator this needs to oversee in order to create or boost and foster initial governance in Common Stack?
Yeah, so this is very much an unanswered question still, because of course the people who make the rules of these communities, this is a tricky time, because you want to give the governance and the trust to the people who are launching these communities, but you also want to encourage continued participation and new users and new ideas. So there's always a balance to strike between the influence of the early joiners and the inclusion of later joiners. So I don't think there's one silver bullet solution that will work for all communities, and it will vary widely depending on the inclusion of various groups and stakeholder groups in the launching of these systems. Sorry, what was your question in particular?
No, I think I was just trying to cover if you could envision the boundaries on which the orchestrator could act, or it could craft some action to then generate what you just mentioned, like attract initial user member that then will benefit from the governance that is, let's say, generated by trusted seeds. So this was, let's say, what I was trying to trigger a conversation about this. Yeah,
for sure. So the governance that we typically talk about in the Common Stack is conviction voting. Conviction voting is a real-time dynamic process. So rather than having a vote on Friday that is binary, it's either yes or no, we are creating a real-time governance mechanism that operates more like neurons in the human brain. So in a neuron, you have action potential building up until a certain threshold is reached, and then the neuron fires. And this is how decentralized collaboration between neurons turns into thoughts and actions of a larger meta-organism, us. So what we're trying to do is mimic those processes through real-time governance, because we can now do this with blockchain technology. We have rich temporal data streams, and we can say, among the 5 proposals that are on the table, maybe one proposal is everyone in this community should get universal basic income, or everyone in this community should get some healthcare benefits. It could be any proposal that a community puts on the table, and then everyone can signal their preference for or against, along with the weight of tokens. So I can say I'm 25% for that proposal, I'm 10% for that proposal, I'm 15% for that proposal, and these votes gain weight over time. So the conviction of these increases according to a half-life decay curve. So this gives a real-time signal, because these signals from each individual in those communities can be aggregated to a community sentiment, and you can actually see how the community is pro some of these proposals and against some of these other proposals, and it gives you a real-time insight into how these communities want to move forward. You know, are they moving towards fascism, or are they moving towards, you know, egalitarianism? We now have a real-time data stream to see how these communities operate. And of course, that isn't the silver bullet solution again. You may need things like quadratic voting, because conviction voting is still token weighted voting. So it's still essentially plutocratic. So you could have quadratic voting, which is essentially like an explicit agreement between large token holders and small token holders that there will be some kind of vote subsidy. So it's the people with a lot of power saying, look, minorities, we respect your opinion. We think it is more beneficial for our community if your voice is heard. I'm going to subsidize your vote with some of my vote. This is quadratic voting. You could also have liquid democracy. So, for example, if you can't expect every community member to vote on every proposal. So you could have a liquid delegation network where I say, hey, regarding, you know, platform design toolkit decisions, Renzo knows much more than me. I'm going to delegate my vote in those matters in that domain to him. And he can cast them on my behalf. So there's all sorts of different mechanisms you can compose. And of course, you can't say that, you know, there is one solution for every community. Some may include a couple of these different governance mechanisms. Some may choose less. It really depends on the context and the people in those communities. But ultimately, because we are choosing, we're voting with our feet, which communities, which economies to be a part of. If you see the people with most governance in your community not sharing either through quadratic voting or liquid democracy, you can choose to, you know, take your contribution to another community, another commons. So this is kind of the way we see, you know, these kinds of economic systems playing out in the future.
I think you are mentioning communities and and value creation. So once Common Stack will creating and will keep creating this, I think, open library to generate self-sustaining, basically, commons. So when we look at, let's say, a need to facilitate this network model, and if we consider a Common Stack, they create a common language, a protocol. So how does the Common Stack could facilitate a common language, a protocol in the ecosystem?
So how can the Common Stack create a common language for these kinds of ecosystems? Yeah. So yeah, I haven't been in the crypto space so long myself, only about 1.5 years or 2 years now. But some of the members of our team, like Griff Green and Michael Zargum, have been around much longer. And they've seen a lot of the common stumbling blocks in creating these kinds of ecosystems. I guess an analogy I can use is, so I studied electrical engineering, and in the early days of engineering, of designing circuits, you breadboard them. And a breadboard is like a little kind of wafer, and you literally hand plug in wires and resistors and capacitors, and you design a light and a battery, and you create very simple circuits. But it's very time consuming. You have to plug in each thing. You have to test it, but it's part of the early design phase of a circuit. Once you understand that your circuit works in breadboarding fashion, you can move towards printed circuit boards. So you can create on the computer, you create a circuit, you run it through a simulation test, and you test all sorts of things. You test what happens if there is a 10,000 volt spike. Is this going to explode in my pocket? Because we need to know that when we're designing electrical devices. So there's early design is breadboarding of these systems, and this is where we're at with DAOs today. Everyone in these ecosystems is trying to figure out how to create almost everything from scratch, and it's a discovery process, which I think is important, but it's also very time consuming, and a lot of people get things wrong, and we see that in a lot of the DAO trials and tribulations in the space today, because everyone is trying to solve these common problems. So our idea at the Common Stack is to create these simulations, these circuit diagrams that you can now run through parameter sweeps and Monte Carlo analyses and agent-based modeling, and do all of the the difficult work in simulation, and then we can produce these reusable templates that communities can take and basically, customize to their needs, and then print them out like printed circuit boards, which is how we have the computers in front of us. If we were still breadboarding circuits, we wouldn't have computers, we wouldn't have cell phones. So we basically need to go from the breadboarding phase, where everyone is trying to figure out all of these things on their own, to a phase where we have convivial tools. We have replicable templates of bonding curves, of conviction voting, of all these different components and how they fit together. And we can run them through simulation to make sure they don't fail under certain conditions. And then we can launch them, in code, which is kind of, step one in the crypto space today.
I think probably another tool that I've seen recently about, you mentioned about simulator. So there is an interesting common simulator game that on the platform has been, I think, kind of redefined probably, and now it's ready to be used and members can engage. I think that could be a deep, from my perspective, what I'm trying to play around with this was more like a deep cultural impact to understand, okay, what's the impact of creating a commons with a gamification approach. Maybe Jeff, could you just tell us a kind of overview about this common simulator that actually is also a way to create a learning experience, and that would be create also a measurement of how the communities keep creating maybe a critical mass potentially. So that was an introduction to ask you to create this overview about this tool.
Yeah, definitely. So CAD itself is the engine behind the simulations and the modeling of these systems. It's a data science tool. It sits on the Python stack. And I mean, unless you're a data scientist, it isn't very easy to use. You need to have some data science skills. You need to have some complexity systems design skills. And then you can work with CAD in Python directly. But for most users, we can't expect them to go to that length. So we need to create these simulations in a tangible, understandable format. So having the common simulator is basically integrating art and storytelling along with kind of like a flight simulator. You are giving these communities a context, and you're giving them the opportunity to play with these parameters. What are the what are the length of proposals? How many proposals do you anticipate your community to have? How much money does your community want to invest in this initiative? You can set all these parameters, and then you can hit simulate in this game, and it will pull the data from a CAD backend. So it's still running the same simulation and compute in CAD, but it's pulling the data into a much more user-friendly, tangible experience where they can get a knowledge of the power of these kinds of community augmentation tools, and B, an idea of what that can do for their community and how they can move forward using common stack components and kind of learn, it's a flight simulator for how this new kind of community economic action can come about.
Okay, so do you think that so far for this tool has created a benefit from the minimum value commons? As you mentioned on your platform, there is some benefit that created more engagement?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, the Common Simulator hasn't launched yet. It is a community project, so since the Common Stack is radically open source, we are openly working on this Common Simulator with various community developers and artists and storytellers, so that it is an open project, but it's not complete yet. So it has not been launched as a live simulator to the public just yet.
Okay, so I think before you were mentioning how other organization and platform were trying to solve the problem of creating tools so organization can build a blockchain. So recently, probably you might have seen that Polkadot has been launched and its library. So in terms of, if we consider these research development oceans of experiments that in the blockchain space they're trying to facilitate decentralization. So the awareness of the narrative becomes as important and as also tricky to generate engagement towards themes such as, for example, competition, profit, externalities. So how does the Common Stack implement its narrative as an opportunity to connect with communities, and what are the challenges, opportunities in this regard?
Yeah, I think there are definitely our goal is to realign incentives. We want to realign incentives so that the altruists who are contributing their time and their money to the production of public goods aren't the suckers in this global game, because in kind of like free market capitalism, any group, any community, any company that is diverting profits to even things like environmental sustainability are actually losing out in this kind of like profit-seeking economic paradigm we live in, to people who are just prioritizing profits over sustainability. So what we're trying to do is address that core problem by rewarding the altruists and the people producing public goods through these novel economic mechanisms. It is a tricky proposition because it often talks about words that seem counterintuitive to the common space, like profit. Is often seen as a dirty word, but I think a lot of these are kind of like semantic terms. Profit is also surplus, and surplus is security for the future. So it really talks. It's a tricky space to navigate, and I think the Common Stack has not always done the greatest job. We've definitely got some criticism about over financialization of commons-based tools, which, I mean, it's always a tricky line to walk between market mechanisms for the commons. But I think we have seen several interesting examples throughout history of commons-based markets, and I think that's what the bonding curve essentially offers, is the opportunity to embed contextually appropriate governance directly in the market mechanisms, so that we can have almost the best of both worlds between free market capabilities, but also within a framework of redistribution and healthy societies. And that's, again, it's not a one-shot solution. I don't think we'll get this right on the first go or even the second go, but the importance of the engineering modeling is that we can continually improve because we have a common framework that we are building off of. And this is how all engineering disciplines mature. If you've heard of Galloping Gertie or the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, this was the bridge they didn't take into account harmonic resonance. And the wind was blowing at the exact right frequency to actually make the bridge go like this, and it eventually collapsed. And this was, a tragedy and horrific. But from that point on, all bridge designs now account for harmonic resonance. So once we have a standard framework of modeling and simulation, we can steadily improve these kinds of community designs to bring about a more equitable world.
I think you were mentioning some terms such as trust. It could be basically the social capital of the ecosystem. So if you look at these as a key foundation in communities, so how might these be scaled as a common good, as a driver for sustainable change? It's a big question, but at the same time, it's also a part of this open source project that eventually will breathe on trust, if these could be something that is shared and then it could be leveraged. So I was just wondering how, in your view, with Common Stack can be considered as a common good for sustainable change.
Yeah, and I think trust is really what this technology comes down to, because we see, in commons-based communities today, they operate extremely well. There are Ostrom's principles, and if these principles, not that they are implemented successfully in every case, but we see when you have trust in these small communities, that this style of collaboration does work actually, and better than you know, global economic systems that can be extractive and lead to other problems down the line. They're highly efficient, but they're not necessarily resilient. They optimize out the backup that we need, and we see this kind of, you know, in the COVID crisis, or in, you know, in America today. There's all sorts of problems that are playing out because of this hyper drive for efficiency. And I think where we stand today is we now have a technology that we can scale this trust. And I don't mean scale in the traditional, you know, Silicon Valley business mindset, but scaling not just a homogeneous solution, but scaling and allowing for interoperability of these kind of federated communities. So you have interoperability between the communities. Each community can determine what is appropriate, you know, constitution, code of conduct for their members. And they can grow beyond, you know, this Dunbar's number, which is kind of the person-to-person trust level that we've seen. Kind of, we max out at this level of, you know, understanding the physical interpersonal trust, and being able to represent that trust through tokenization and you know, trustless verification, and so on and so forth. So I think that trust is really what this technology brings to communities who want to use these successful practices at larger and larger scales worldwide.
So even we consider tokens. So tokens, they are vehicles for inclusivity, integrity, potentially, and a new trust, like you mentioned. I think I want to make a link with, I saw in one of your latest interview with the regenerative economy group. I don't remember his name. I think it was a very interesting.
Gregory, yeah.
Yes, Gregory. It was an interesting conversation where I think you mentioned how the idea of the currency competition that we are involved at the moment. So, from the idea of as a tokens, as also a representation of resilience. So, and how commons could then create a system health. So again, from the perception of what common stack impact could create through token economies. So how could common stack gain resilience in their approach? How can the ecosystem be kept healthy with the resilience in order to keep expanding?
Yeah, and I think you know, we are still in such early days of Web3 and tokenization in general. So I think it's difficult to look so far down the line and say how it will all come about. But I think what we have identified as necessity in these kinds of token networks is interoperability. And this is also something that is brought about through the bonding curve. It's brought about through the Giveth proposal engine. Is basically that these communities can collaborate, that they have some common language between them, and also, you know, in the community inclusion currency example, there are local currencies worldwide that are doing amazing things for their communities. But the problem with those local currencies is once you leave those communities, the value that is produced and represented by these local tokens are not translatable into other local currencies. So this is where the bonding curve basically acts as you know, a verifiable on-chain collateral that gives a price relative to other communities that are also on bonding curves. So the bonding curve is kind of the membrane, the semi-permeable membrane that is around this economy. If you kind of think of an economy like a cell, you know, within the cell there is value transmission, but then that value has to be able to transmit or be received across this semi-permeable boundary. And the bonding curve in our explanation is that boundary, that value transfer interface between different local currencies or between different community initiatives. I'm not sure if I went on a bit of a tangent. Did I answer your question with that?
Yeah, no, that's fine. I think you mentioned this example. I think if there are examples that could, I think, be close to the idea of resilience in the ecosystem, please go ahead. Or what even Common Stack is looking at to even improve the engineering model to then get close to that kind of a concept from a culture perspective as much as organizational.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, when we see these token ecosystems of the future, you know, I don't think there will be one token to rule them all. You know, it's not one token per community. Even you may have different tokens for reputation. You have different tokens for expertise. You have different tokens for access. You have different tokens for spending. You have different tokens for saving. And again, all of this comes back to interoperability. To expect that one project is going to come up with all of these different tokens to suit a context is at least at this stage a little bit naive. So this is where we see the standardization that's brought about by token engineering in allowing all of these different tokens to interact in a way that suits the context of a community that needs to use them. This is where we are really driving forward with modeling and simulation and engineering rigor in the design of these tokens, because each token is like a part of the system. And when you build a bridge, it's not just parts. It's not just I-beams and bolts and concrete. It's actually the enmeshing of all of those into a larger system. And building parts is actually much easier than combining parts into a whole, because while an I-beam you know, may be stable as an I-beam, when you connect it with a bolt and concrete and everything else, it breaks down at the interfaces. That's where systems generally fall apart. It's not in the part, it's in the interface. And this is where we really need token engineering to understand the bounds and the limits of our systems and where they're going to fail and how we can design and plan for those failures, because we know that's where they're going to fail, and create you know, cascade failure analysis and be able to limit user action sets in these cases so that, you know, any action that's taken by a user pushes the system back towards stability rather than pushing it down the spiral towards collapse.
I have some questions. I don't know if it's a good moment to jump in.
Yeah, go ahead, Simone.
Yeah, so I'm trying to situate these in the conversation that we are having more generally on the evolution of organizing. And so I think we see to some extent an overlap of paradigms, as always, because paradigms don't change, you know, like this, you know, there is an overlap of always, no? So we are seeing, I think, the existence of the traditional corporate and the birth of different models of organizing more maybe to a local scale or you know, experiments in terms of mutual credit systems and the things that you partially mentioned. And yeah, to some extent, essentially, we're also trying to interpret these dynamics, and we see that to some extent at the global level, there is now such a big ramping risk that is coming up. No? So systems are breaking down because of too much risk, and there is probably some kind of pressure to deflate this risk and to some extent relocalize part of the economy. And as a you know, in this process of relocalization, you do it because you want to deflate the risk, and then in the process you also reorient the landscape of organizing. So you reorient basically, for example, what constituencies you are talking with, and who becomes the let's say the engine of entrepreneurship. No, it's no more just the corporate, the multinational corporate. Maybe we start to see the idea that there may be new constituents that will build economic activity, that will be maybe focused on resilient and shorter supply chains. We don't know the scale yet. We imagine that this is going to happen at regional scale, maybe. So to some extent, it still needs quite a complex organization. Maybe it will be the evolution of existing organization that will mold into regional interoperating systems. So my question is, what is your hypothesis? What are the constituents you are building on, if you have any? And the other question that I have, maybe I can ask this later. So first of all, let's start from this. Who is the constituent? What are the constituents you're thinking about? What is your, your idea in terms of, what kind of elements and entities are going to use these to build new productive commons-based systems?
Yeah, definitely. We kind of have these three. We have the private sector, the public sector, and the civic sector. In the private sector, we have like the corporate model or the business model, at all these various levels, from SME all the way up to, Fortune 500. In the public sphere, we have governments, we have national, we have provincial, we have municipal, etc. The civic sector is where we're focusing. So we're trying to build, you could consider it almost like nervous systems or replicable templates for communities of people to start collaborating in ways that similar to corporations or governance or governments, but kind of giving them the replicable toolkits so they can begin to collaborate and self-organize in these commons-based economies. And again, as I mentioned before, we're focusing on the very smallest unit, the cell. The smallest economy. This is like a community economy. This could be a household. This could be, as small as you can make it. And then also in the biomimetic analogy, we see these as federating. So it's not saying that it needs to be one giant cell, like one economy. You can have multiple diverse economies as long as they are able to translate and interoperate between them. So you could have smaller cells joining into a larger cell. You could have larger cells joining into even larger, and this is the way we see life evolving. You had single-celled organisms; those cells started specializing, turning into organs. And organs, compose a even larger kind of federated intelligence that forms us, for example. So we're still in very, very early days, but we see the cell as the kind of the civic economy, the useful unit of community collaboration. Other communities can also use this. Those communities can be communities of communities and communities of communities of communities at the bioregional level, at the national level, at the global level, and you can kind of have this much more fluid, whether it's governance, whether it's resource flows. You have a much more dynamic and biomimetic approach to this kind of civic cooperation that doesn't just rely on corporations and nation states. And I would say those two forms of collaboration are the effectively only two that are permitted to create currencies. So governments create fiat currency, corporations create stock. They have access to global pools of capital that purchase their token, whether that is Apple stock, Google stock, Tesla stock, and now we're providing these same toolkits to communities and giving them the same leverage, or not the same leverage, but these tools to collaborate and create and distribute wealth in the community, rather than requiring these larger national or international organizations.
And so it's clear to me, I think it's really something that we are seeing coming up more and more, no? This idea that to some extent now it's like technology made, monetary policies and advanced financial tools design, financial assets design available, and so we cannot start back. We can start the economy on another basis because now we have the technology to some extent, and that's very interesting in general. Is this? Do you imagine this as something like a tool for commons engineers?
Definitely. Yeah, we see a lot of these as convivial tools that we, it's not easy to create the mathematical framework to start from scratch. But once you kind of have a template, that template can be customized for a whole bunch of different use cases. And not to say that will solve all the problems, but I think once we have the engineering framework, we can continue to iterate piece by piece and build these systems for the communities that need them.
Just one question more into interoperability, and you spoke about this idea of scaling across systems. How do you see that? Is just, basically price signals? How does it work? How do you see that interoperate between, for example, I create something with common stack here, and I have a certain currency which has some token rights attached to it, and a price, and something like that, and somebody else in Switzerland is doing something different. So how do you imagine this interoperate, not just technically, but also, I would say, both technically and conceptually? Why should these small entities interoperate and build a more networked economy? Why should this happen?
Yeah, and I think that, Hayek was all about price as a signal, incorporating a whole bunch of, a lot of different information is collapsed into price. The problem, I think, with our one-dimensional markets today is that it's only price. You don't have enough information about what is collapsed into that signal. I think in the early days of token economies, we're still dealing with, until we have, for example, strong identity, self-sovereign identity, a lot of this will still be plutocratic. So we still are facing some of the issues of the, this one-dimensional price metric. But now we have a kind of a rainbow of prices. It's not just the fiat price. You can also price it in terms of different tokens and governance and reputation, and you kind of get a different spectrum of price at this point in time. And I think we will see, as this experiment evolves, all sorts of because you could create a completely market independent bonding curve too. You could completely restrict buying and selling from fiat economies and just allow it within a closed community. So there are all sorts of, you could make it a completely impermeable barrier, in other words. But in my analysis so far, and this is, I think, what has held local currencies back up until this point, is that they cannot interface with the real world. So if you are a completely contained economy and you can create your own cell phones and you can build your own airplanes and you can sell your own cars and everything else, yeah, sure, you can be a completely contained economy on your own. But oftentimes what needs to happen is the value that is produced in a community needs to be translated into another economy. And today we still do that through money and prices. But I think once we start opening up this spectrum of value, we will have much richer ways to represent not just the bottom line, but also ecological health, social health, cultural health, and a range of other values outside of just the bottom dollar. So I think we're still very early days, and it's sometimes frustrating to think that it still boils down to token price go up. But this is, again, it's kind of it's like the internet in the 80s. It's not quite there for all the use cases we need it, but I think we can take it step by step and continue to improve as we go.
Yeah, well, I mean, I also think it's a huge cultural gap that we need to build, because if I look at the maturity of the technical solutions, it's really increasing fast and it's really promising. But now, you don't just need tools for citizen entrepreneurship, you need citizen entrepreneurs. So you need people that detach themselves from, working within the traditional capitalist organizations and markets, and yet they actually decide, consciously they want to build citizen-led enterprises, and they want to take care of, core systems such as, food, energy, and local mobility or whatever, or health or welfare or health at a more local level, which is something you need to decide to do. It's not something that it's just a matter of having the tools. You have the tools, but now you need to just you need to have the talent and the entrepreneurs that actually want to build these things, which requires I guess either some kind of dramatic collapse of some other support systems that we have, or a massive epistemic change and a massive cultural change, which I think we're both witnessing at the moment. So that's really interesting. I mean, the work is pretty clear, I think, and I think it's really promising. So I'm excited to see how it goes forward.
Yeah, definitely. And I think what goes along part and parcel with that is the business models to encourage this kind of entrepreneurship and innovation. And I think this is one of the stumbling blocks of Web3 so far is a lot of the investment, VC investment, or I mean, their grants are another thing, I guess, but we are seeing that, you know, the production of public goods isn't actually suited to Web2 style business models where you're looking at, you know, what is your, you know, product market fit and you know, how do you earn revenue in public goods production? And I think the bonding curve and other crypto economic innovations are kind of opening up the spectrum for us to play with different ways that we can encourage that entrepreneurialism and reward those altruists, because a lot of people in this space are severely underpaid. And that goes for the common stack as well. You know, in the production of public goods, where you're not looking to sell a product, it's not investable. There's very little opportunity for revenue. It relies on donations, and eventually, you know, those donations are never sufficient, and the entrepreneurs burn out and go back to industry and do something, you know, for Facebook or Google.
But to some extent, I think it also depends on having now entrepreneurs that understand that, you know, if you design post-industrial organizations, you still can design large-scale organizations. So it's not just, you know, designing corner shop scale initiatives that will suffer the problems that you mentioned, but it's just okay. You know, we're just designing, you know, with the same ambitions, but based on a different, you know, kind of basic approaches. No? So again, this idea of scaling across and designing interoperable systems is something that we really need to, I think, learn about. We need to understand what does it mean. You know, how do you build, for example, a food distribution system that is not a retail chain, but it's maybe, you know, a much more complex and adaptive system of distribution that still can be nationwide, maybe, or it can be region-wide, and can be still, you know, moving around billions of you know, dollars of food, you know, but in a much different way. So I think as long as we don't have these ambitions playing out with success, demonstrating success, and this is something that, for example, James Currier said in our podcast when we started. I think it was the second one that we registered, and he said, yeah, really, the platform co-op, for example, the platform co-op model, this really is really interesting, but we need something that really shows that these models can work and compete with the existing models. Sorry for the kids screaming in the background.
You probably want to respond, but I also was curious if you wanted to show a couple of things on your screen before we close the call. That would be great, because it triggered a lot of curiosity also.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I've been working with a number of engineers. Let me see if I can share here. Let me know if you can see the Miro board.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. So yeah, so we've been working with the platform design toolkit and also the ecosystem design toolkit, which as we chatted about before was a fork, to work with communities, because a lot of groups are very interested in what we're working on, but the question is often like, how do I start? Where do I, you know, I want to get my hands dirty with this. And in engineering, it's basically you know, system specification. So who are your users? What do they need it for? What are their incentives, their behaviors, and so on and so forth. So we've really taken to using the platform design toolkit and other offshoots to start mapping out those. Let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger. Not that big. Anyway, this was actually part of a hackathon a few months back. This example in particular is a democratized renewable energy system. So there are basically, they're called solar tainers. They drop off basically a shipping container with batteries and solar panels, and it will produce solar energy and share it with the village, but they need to pay for it. So how do they bring these in through investment from outside corporations, but also through community ownership and tokenization. So they basically have a token ecosystem where the community is earning tokens, the investors are earning tokens, and then there is a democratic kind of governance system that allows for profit sharing in more equitable ways. So starting with the ecosystem design motivation matrix, and then listing out all of your users, all of the different behaviors and interactions between these users. And eventually this turns into CAD modeling. I don't know if you guys have seen any of the stock and flow diagrams. This is essentially like what happens in business logic in a lot of times. And this may not be a great example. I don't know if this one is actually complete, but this was one of the examples that moved from the platform design toolkit as kind of like a specification requirements gathering, and then turning that into how these flows exist in the system. How does governance flow in the system? How does value flow in the system in whatever form? And then from there, you create what we call a differential specification. So this is talking about different policies that occur on behalf of the environment, on behalf of the user, and on behalf of the system that they're operating in. How does that, how do those behaviors update the system logic and the states of the system and the metrics that are being measured? So this basically turns it into a more rigorous engineering framework that can then be plugged into CAD as a data science tool. And then simulations can be run, and you can start doing, all of the parameter sweeps, Monte Carlo analyses, and so on and so forth. So I'm definitely happy to share some of these with you guys. I don't know if you've spoken with Shebnem from Freelio. This is actually a CAD representation of the Freelio project with the solar tainers. And there are a number of other token engineering community members who have kind of walked through this design process from requirements and specifications all the way to stock and flow diagrams, differential specifications, and even plugging these early systems into CAD. And then the idea is, once we have these CAD templates, the next group that comes along with, there are solar projects all around the world that could benefit from this template. So it's kind of creating these convivial tools that similar projects can benchmark off of, improve, see what worked, see what failed, reduce the barriers to entry. Simone, you mentioned earlier, like we have these large corporations or these large governments. How do we basically remove barriers to entry and create smaller, scalable, smaller, I think the word is unitization in the social impact bond space. And actually, you mentioned risk as well, Simone. There's some really interesting research going on with the ICSO Foundation around risk-adjusted bonding curves. So in other words, these bonds can, social impact bonds can react to real-time signals of risk from the ground where these projects are launching. So I don't want to go too much into detail there because that's its own its own talk on alpha bonds, but there's definitely a lot of exciting area to explore here. Yeah,
I mean, in general, I think what I see, and this is also a good point probably to close the conversation, is that what we see is some kind of radical democratization of both the let's say the capability to design financial instruments and complex systems of interaction and monetary policies, all coming together thanks to technology. Of course, since this has been so fast, basically now we need to learn how to use it, and to some extent this takes time. But I think when the need comes, because as I said before, either because we have this massive educational epistemic transformation, or on the other hand, the other systems, the traditional system breakdown, which is something that we are seeing at these days with the pandemics or what's happening in the US, whatever, that things are getting fairly crazy. So I'm sure that there will be some kind of reorientation of entrepreneurship into into these systems, and then we will use the technology, because it's there. So we're not going to make things like 50 years ago. We're going to reinvent the local economy on a technological basis, and putting together local visions with this kind of technologies. I think it's going to be very interesting. It's going to be for sure very important, and then hopefully also very interesting.
Yeah, completely agreed. Completely agreed with you there.
So I see, from the call today, I see that Common Stack has possible, for sure, it's going to be one of the things that are going to show up in terms of possibly having a radical role in enabling these new experimentations. So I'm really excited to share this with the community, like we did last week with the recording of Aragon, and possibly following up with more content, trying to really explain how this is something we need to focus on now as entrepreneurs, and not just something for kids buying crypto online and speculating. That's not the case. I mean, this is really massive.
Yeah, definitely. I think the early trials and failures of this space are it's a discovery process. It's we are where we are, but I think there's such a wide design space to explore, and as long as we are doing it, I think the commonest values are really important, because this is really the killer app of blockchain, is scaling trust to allow these kinds of collaborative paradigms to flourish.
Yeah, well, now we need the killer user.
yeah, and the killer designers too. Like,
yeah,
this is,
that's it. Because we have the killer app, now we need the users. That's it.
Yeah.
I think we have everything in the room here. We can do some presentation between killer researcher, killer user, killer app. I think we are on a good side, good set track.
Oh, but I tried to, for example, personally, and then we close. I tried to focus on community entrepreneurship, and sometimes when you even think about what does it take to build, I don't know, for example, a shared community garden in permaculture, it takes a lot. It takes a lot of time. You need to think about how do you make the investment, how do you get the people to take decisions together. And, I don't think people understand what we need now, in terms of developing these skills, not just the skills of, technically implementing systems, but really the warm aspects that Jeff, you mentioned, this idea that it takes new skills to also build the constituents, and to create design processes that go through these constituents. And so it's a mix, between the tools, the decision-making approaches, and the digital tools, and the vision, and whatever. But it's gonna take a lot of intention and effort.
Definitely. And I think there's no one answer. There's no one project that's going to, solve all of the problems. This is, being tackled by so many different groups. I'm not sure if you guys have come across the Meta Governance project. They're basically creating a repo of like various types of online governance that can be used from, games to social media to communities to, there's so many different pieces of the puzzle. And bringing it to the users as well, which is, where Renzo and I first connected, is, bringing this to, a consideration of how do people actually get their hands on and interact with these tools. And I think that's something that's been largely ignored by the blockchain space so far. And I think it's all totally necessary, and it's all coming together as it needs to. It's always nice to think it would be faster, but we're all here, we're all working on different aspects of the problem, and I think that's how we're going to move this forward. It's going to
be faster, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think just to build up on this, just to the mission we all have is just to create a translation of this concept in a way that could be digestible and experimented. And I think PDT and all the tools that we can generate together, that could create, I think, a value for the people in the street. They could create in the commons, and then the commons will become, the new economy. So we need to all have this bottom-up concept, I think, in our toolkit.
Yeah, and I think, just as a final remark, because I've worked a lot in the international cooperation space, and when, I got really excited when I heard about your project, in Kenya with the Red Cross and so on. And I've been now in this space for a while, and the crypto is still for me like I have to sharpen my my ears to follow and like to get the bigger picture of it. So I can definitely see that will be some way to go for many of these bureaucratic contexts. But like Simone said, I think it's really going to speed up because everything is happening somehow now.
Yeah, definitely.
I think the last question, or the last two for you, Jeff, before we close, I don't know if Simone, Sina want to add anything else. Do you have any announcement, Jeff, you want to share to the audience that could create more engagement or more curiosity about the next step for Common Stack?
Yeah, definitely. So we are actively growing the trusted seed, and the trusted seed of the Common Stack are, again, people who have contributed either funds or time or labor to the building of these components and these ecosystems. And actually, one thing I would love to do is to dish all of you some praise. And this is kind of our way of recognizing the time and efforts of people who are collaborating with the Common Stack. That praise turns into C-Stack tokens, which makes you part of the trusted seed and able to participate in all of these future Commons launches that use the Common Stack components. So I would love to do that. That happens in our Telegram channel in the Common Stack, t.me/CommonStack. And we definitely encourage people to get involved in the trusted seed, because this is where we want to see the community growing and supporting this kind of new collaborative ecosystems moving forward. So also you can go to commonstack.org/apply and you can sign up for the trusted seed there. We have a couple of questions. We just want to make sure that you're not, a profit-seeking investor essentially, and that you are working towards the building of these collaborative Web3 ecosystems. And yeah, we are excited to continue to grow the community and the people who are interested in designing and using these new structures for a better future.
I think we'll be happy to do so. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to share this with the community. Again, thanks very much, Jeff, and talk to you at the soonest.
Yeah, great chatting with you guys. We'll talk again soon.